All right. Welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on Last Week I Learned. So, just to give you a heads up, the way this is going to work is we're going to have the newsletter, which is like shallow dives, quick hits of interesting things. And then this is a deep dive on a particular topic. So, this week's topic is ethical eating. This came out of the last deep dive, which is about dog adoption. And really, what I started to recognize is in America, dogs are kind of this sacred cow that we say we treasure. And it was really difficult to read about how poorly we treat dogs. And, I have some experience with this working in shelters, but I really was not ready for, in particular, puppy mills. And what was really disturbing is puppy mills are kind of like factory farming for dogs, right? And so, of course, that kind of led me to wonder, well, what don't I know about factory farms? And growing up, I was lucky to be in environmental science and some classes, and also to work on an organic farm where we had, chickens and goats and a couple other animals in addition to the farming. And so I had exposure to, how the food system works, but I don't think I really felt it until I did this dog adoption deep dive and dug into puppy mills. And so I wanted to learn more and really make some practical changes. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I learned. And at the end, I'll talk through what type of things I'm trying out to try to address this head on. And of course, there's a lot I'm unsure about. There's probably another deep dive to come out of this, but I want to start with just what I'm trying now and working through now. So, right. First, I want to talk about kind of the history of factory farming. This was interesting for me and was new. And really the start for me in terms of digging into this was The Jungle, which is this book written by Upton Sinclair, kind of way back in the early 1900s. I learned about this actually in school. And there was this sweeping through the nation of journalism called muckraking, where you were trying to find dirt. And, we had this huge boom in the U.S. of immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which included my family from Italy. So you had a lot of really poor labor practices going on and just a lot of mistreatment of people and animals. And so Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was written about meatpacking in Chicago, right? And so it was kind of this intersection of an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and then these new technologies, refrigeration and railroads, that made it possible to process meat in a different way. So this is where this all starts, is new technologies allowing for more efficient transfer of, animal products, both in terms of speed and in terms of cooling, so food safety, and then this overabundance of labor, in part, kind of engineered by our immigration policy at the time, and by, food insecurity and economic woes in Europe. So a lot of factors kind of came together to make this possible. Another factor that I am neglecting here is actually the growth of ranching in the U.S. So ranching wasn't really a super big thing when the U.S. was pretty small, right? If you're thinking about just the eastern coast, you're really talking about an agricultural economy, right? So you're seeing cotton growth from the south on plantations, and you're seeing, I'm trying to think of like corn in Indiana and throughout the U.S., but there's not a lot of land for ranching. And when the U.S. started moving westward, there was this kind of unlock in terms of land for ranching. So that's part of what's changing here too, is the expansion in the U.S. Of course, by conquest, right? First, we had, I'm trying to think of the order this worked out, but the incorporation of Texas. And then during the Civil War, this is not super well known, there's a great book called, it's not Burying My Heart at Wounded Knee, but it's similar. The Heart of Everything That Is, that talks about the war with the Plains Indians, in particular the Sioux / Lakota in particular, if we're getting really specific. And so that was happening concurrently with the Civil War, is there was a war going on in the Western US. And so all that to say, lots of factors basically emerged to mean we had a lot of meat, a lot of land, and a lot of people, and it allowed the development of factory farming. And I guess you could also include the rise of industrialization, right? So we're starting to think about factories, we're starting to think about systems. How can we break things up into smaller and smaller parts? How can we de-skill labor, right? All these things are happening at the turn of the 19th century, or the 20th century, so early 1900s, okay? And that's where the roots of factory farming are. And so there's a ton of change here. And that is one of the things I find really interesting, because I just kind of took this as reality, right? We have factory farming. That is where meat comes from. I was vaguely aware of that, but I didn't realize this is pretty new. This is like an 120-year-old technology and system that's been set up. And really, in some cases, which was really surprising, it's even newer than that. So the factory farming of pigs really didn't come about until the 1970s. It's particularly cruel, but it was difficult to figure out how to fit pigs into the factory farming context. And even as well, poultry, chicken, wasn't actually really that popular of a meat for consumption until I'm trying to think of the 50s. So this is very new. And what that tells me is it's very possible to change it and to undo this. Another kind of interesting note here is that internationally, this is not the de facto way of food production either, right? So in other countries that have not industrialized to the same degree the US has, this is not normal. Actually, the vast majority of meat produced in the world is not factory farmed. Am I thinking? Yes, I think that's correct. Now, there might be some conflicting opinions. All my sources are going to be in the show notes. You can look at this. I have this Readwise link that'll allow you to pick out what I've read. And then I'm also going to try to publish just my scattered thoughts about this and some quotes and specific stuff. So you can dig into both of those for particular hours. I'm just kind of giving like high level understandings, right? So the takeaways so far are, this is really new. It's a new system enabled by new technologies like refrigeration and rail, and then also, trucking and refrigerated trucking. And further, it's influenced by, migration patterns in terms of workers and labor, and then labor laws as well, which we'll get into a little bit. And what I find really interesting about this is, one, we vastly improved at one point in time the labor practices in the food industry, right? Upton Sinclair's writing was effective in achieving improved labor conditions and improved pay for people in the meatpacking industry. Now, that was wound down in the 1970s in the era of Ronald Reagan, which is really unfortunate and leads us to where we are now, which is effectively, as far as I can tell, the same place we were at in the 1900s when The Jungle was written. Now, there's one great article I want to point out, and it's going to be in the show notes. It's someone went in undercover, basically, and worked 6 months at a meatpacking factory in, I think it was Nebraska. And what's scary is, I think that probably could have been pulled from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, written 100 years earlier. So we're back at this place where companies are effectively recruiting from immigrant labor forces because they can exploit them and pay them less. We have really, really poor outcomes in terms of health for the communities around factory farming. In addition to the people working inside factory farms, it's one of the most dangerous industries in the country, is meatpacking. And it really is kind of depressing to see this lack of progress. And I want to point out now a few bright spots, though, that I think are interesting. One is permaculture. This is what I experienced on the organic farm I was at. And it's really taking a systems approach to agriculture, right? And thinking about more than just the mechanization of food, where it's like inputs to outputs, but really thinking it as a whole system. how can we achieve efficiency? And it's a very different way of thinking about things, and it's very exciting because you can have incredible efficiency via permaculture without some of the negative externalities of factory farming, right? So what did that look like? When I say permaculture, what does that look like? So on our little tiny farm, we were, well, I'm trying to even think about how to explain where to start in terms of the system. There were all these practices that were really fascinating that increased yield. So I'll start from me when I would eat food, right? I would take the scraps and I would put it into either the chickens pile, the compost pile, or the worm pile, right? And so this is effectively a closed loop in terms of food. So the food I was eating was either going to chickens, which then make eggs, and if you want to, meat, or it's going to compost, which is going to turn into like soil for the farm, or it's going to the worms, which are going to produce more soil as well. So everything was feeding back into the system, and it was really impressive. And we even got to the point where you could start to take, we did forest thinning because it was in a forest fire susceptible place, and that could actually turn into, the wood could become fire for heating, or it could become the kind of starting point for fungus and basically mushrooms that you can get out of your food system. So permaculture is really thinking about things more systematically than factory farming does. So that's one of the bright spots. Another bright spot is really just enforcing EPA laws, so and broadening them. So the EPA, unfortunately, with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, is really focused on actual industrial outputs, right? So we're thinking about manufacturing. And it does technically, there are some laws on the books to deal with factory farming and its outputs, right? Because we see really negative impacts on local communities in terms of health outcomes. But it's not well enforced, it's not well funded. So I think at the local level, that is one of the biggest levers we can push on, is extending the EPA's protections that exist to handle factory farming and push on it that way. So all that said, I want to end with what I'm actually doing about this. And so for a long time, my kind of eating habits were, the biggest shift was moving from red meat to poultry. And I thought that was great. Now, as I've read more and more, I found out poultry is, while marginally better for me health-wise, just really horrific in terms of ethics. Like factory farming for turkey and chickens is pretty difficult to read about, and thus makes it difficult to eat. So what I'm going to do for my at-home meat consumption is I'm going to shift to local, and that is more expensive. And what that's going to mean is I'm going to eat less meat. I already don't eat a ton of meat. A lot of my friends and family are vegetarian, and it's rubbed off on me. So it's not super difficult. The trickier thing is going to be sourcing local meat. Thankfully, I have a place near me that does. I'm really lucky to have that. Now, I don't know how I would navigate this in the store. Just a typical grocery store, because a lot of the labels are meaningless. Antibiotic-free is not well enforced. Organic even can be iffy. Cage-free doesn't really mean a lot. There's a lot of marketing around cruelty-free stuff, but there's not a lot of enforcement and verification. So when it comes to meat, if I'm buying, I think the best I can do is to buy local. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm going to try to do is, well, I guess it's not something I'm going to try to do, but it's a concession I'm going to make, is I'm not going to try to verify meat at restaurants. My goal is just going to be to try to eat vegetarian when I'm eating out, and infrequently treat myself to some meat, because I don't think it's going to be feasible to try to evaluate where every restaurant is sourcing its meat. So I'm just going to mostly eat like a vegetarian when I'm out, and every once in a while treat myself to something, knowing that it's probably not well sourced. So those are just two things I'm trying. So I'm trying to buy meat locally when I'm cooking at home. I'm trying to eat effectively vegetarian when I'm eating out. And the next kind of tricky thing I'm going to try to navigate is figuring out how to eat plants better. Because one of the things that I found most disturbing when reading about this is the ethical considerations of workers in meatpacking and agriculture in general are not treated well, and local communities. And my mom experienced this growing up near a farm in Indiana. There's, even if it's just a typical farm and it's just growing corn, there's runoff from fertilizers into local communities, which causes algae blooms and contamination of groundwater. The manure can be physically sickening, just the scent and the way the wind takes it into your home. And pesticide usage is really, really bad. So the next kind of probably deep dive after the one I have planned, probably going to be how to eat plants more ethically, because that is a big area of concern. And once again, all these labels that we have are not super reliable. So organic, non-GMO, there's just a whole host of things I need to wade into around how I eat plants. So let's recap. 1, factory farming is new, which gives me hope, because if it's very new, it means we can potentially unwind it. 2, factory farming, the side effects go beyond just animal cruelty. The workers aren't treated well, and local communities, disproportionately those of color, are impacted. So this goes beyond just the cruelty to animals as an ethical consideration. And then finally, the things I'm trying here are to eat local meat when I'm buying it at home, because I'm an omnivore in general. And then 2, to try to eat vegetarian when I'm out, because it's really difficult to verify. So I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. If you're interested in more, there are links in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me.